What would make a father finally say, "I don't care anymore"? Tell them everything? Not a lawsuit, not a tabloid headline, but a warning. According to Thomas Markle, the moment that changed everything wasn't public at all. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even dramatic. It was quiet, controlled, and, in his words, terrifying. A message relayed to him that suggested a new memoir was coming, and that his silence was no longer optional. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let that sink in. A memoir. Again. Another book. Another version of events. Another permanent record that would outlive apologies, corrections, and family phone calls that never came. And Thomas claims this time, the message felt different. Not reflective, not therapeutic, but punitive. Ask yourself this. If someone told your story for years and then warned you they were about to tell it again, without you, how long would you stay quiet? This is where our story begins. Not with money, not with fame, but with fear. The fear of being erased completely. For years, Thomas Markle has been portrayed as a footnote, an inconvenience, a cautionary tale. He admits his flaws. He admits mistakes. But he also says something else has been happening behind the scenes, something far more calculated. He believes narratives were being cleaned, repackaged, laundered, not financially, he insists, but reputationally, emotionally, historically. And then comes the name that changes the temperature of the room, Prince Harry. Thomas doesn't claim Harry sent a message directly. What he claims is more unsettling, that the threat of a new memoir was enough. Enough to remind him that books don't just tell stories, they freeze them. They choose heroes and villains. They decide who gets redemption and who becomes a cautionary paragraph. Why does this matter now? Because timing is everything. Another memoir doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lands in a world already primed to believe one version of events. A world where silence is interpreted as guilt, and where fathers who don't fight back are assumed to have nothing worth defending. Then there's Meghan Markle, the center of the storm and the source of the deepest fracture. Thomas says his pain isn't about interviews or documentaries anymore. It's about something simpler and far more devastating. Being written out of his own child's history. He asks a question that should make everyone uncomfortable. When does staying silent stop being dignity and start becoming permission? Because according to him, the warning he received wasn't subtle. It referenced things he says were never meant to be public. Things he believed were buried, forgotten, safely sealed away. And that's when he claims he realized something chilling. If he didn't speak now, he never would. And what he says that warning hinted at is where this story takes a much darker turn. What if the threat wasn't about embarrassment, but about erasure? That's the question that hangs in the air as we pick up from where things turn dark. According to Thomas Markle, the warning he received carried a chilling undertone. Not a shout, not a demand, but an implication. A quiet suggestion that the next memoir wouldn't just revisit old wounds, it would redefine them. Permanently. Think about that for a second. A book doesn't just tell a story. It locks one in. It becomes the citation journalists use. The quote people remember. The version that future generations Google. And Thomas says what shook him wasn't criticism, it was finality. He claims he was made to understand that once those pages hit shelves, his role wouldn't just be negative. It would be unnecessary, optional, almost fictional. And here's where the contradiction begins. Publicly, memoirs are framed as healing journeys, private reckonings, truth-telling exercises. But Thomas says what he sensed had nothing to do with healing. He says it felt like leverage, as if the very idea of a book was being used as a warning label, stay quiet, or be rewritten. He didn't hear this directly from Prince Harry, he insists, but he says the message didn't need a signature. In his mind, it carried all the weight of past patterns. Stories released without warning, claims made without conversation, silence treated as consent. Ask yourself this. If someone had the power to tell your story to millions, would you feel safe knowing they were angry? Thomas describes sleepless nights, replaying old conversations, wondering which moments would be stripped of context, which mistakes would be magnified, which apologies would be omitted. He says it felt less like a family dispute and more like standing on the edge of a narrative cliff, waiting to be pushed. And then there's the irony. For years, critics asked why Thomas didn't speak sooner, why he didn't defend himself more aggressively, why he allowed others to define him. But he says silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint, a belief that eventually, The truth didn't need amplification. Until it did. Because the thread of a memoir changes the math. It transforms personal memory into public property. It turns private pain into chapter headings. And Thomas claims that's when he realized something deeply unsettling. The story wasn't just being told without him. It was being built against him. And at the center of that story, always, is Meghan Markle. Not as a villain in his telling, but as a figure surrounded by a carefully maintained narrative ecosystem. One where contradictions are smoothed, where uncomfortable details quietly disappear. Thomas began asking himself a dangerous question. If silence allowed this version to harden into fact, was staying quiet really protecting anyone, or just protecting a lie? He says that's when the anger arrived. Not explosive rage. Cold, focused anger. The kind that comes when you realize the rules have changed and no one bothered to tell you. Because if the memoir was coming no matter what, then staying silent wouldn't save him. And according to Thomas, that realization led him to examine something far more disturbing. How stories can be cleaned, polished, and presented until the truth underneath is almost unrecognizable. And once he saw that pattern clearly, he claims he couldn't unsee it. But what he says he discovered next would push him from anger into outright defiance. And that's where things begin to unravel fast. What if the most powerful form of laundering isn't money, but memory? That's the unsettling idea Thomas Markle says hit him next. Not all at once. Slowly, piece by piece. Like realizing the room has been rearranged while you weren't looking. According to Thomas Markle, when he uses the phrase dirty laundering, he's not talking about bank accounts or offshore transfers. He's talking about something far more slippery. Reputation, emotion, history, the quiet cleaning of a story until only one version remains presentable. Think about how narratives work. Details aren't always erased. Sometimes they're softened. Sometimes they're skipped. Sometimes they're reframed as misunderstandings or reduced to footnotes or replaced with more flattering explanations. Thomas claims that's what he began to notice when he stepped back and looked at the public story versus his private reality. Here's the contradiction that bothered him most. He says he was portrayed as unpredictable and unreliable, yet his silence was treated as confirmation of guilt. He spoke, and he was accused of seeking attention. He stayed quiet, and he was labeled suspicious. No matter what he did, the narrative tightened around him like shrink wrap. Ask yourself this. How do you defend yourself when the very act of defending yourself is used against you? Thomas began revisiting old interviews, old clips, old headlines. He noticed how certain moments were endlessly replayed, while others vanished completely. Apologies he claims he made never resurfaced. Context was stripped away, time frames blurred, and over time, a simpler story emerged. Cleaner, easier to digest, less messy than real life. At the center of that story, always, was Meghan Markle. Not necessarily as an active architect, Thomas insists, but as the beneficiary of a narrative machine that rewarded clarity over complexity. Victims and villains. Before and after. Good and bad. But families aren't written that way. Real relationships are contradictory. People hurt each other and still love each other. Thomas says that nuance disappeared. And then there's the memoir factor again. Because memoirs don't just tell stories. They validate them. They turn personal memory into published authority. Once it's printed, it's no longer just someone's experience. It's a reference point. And Thomas says that's when he realized the laundering wasn't accidental. It was structural. He began to feel that the silence he thought was respectful had become a tool. That every month he didn't speak allowed the cleaned-up version to harden, to become the only version people recognized. And here's the emotional spike. Thomas says he reached a breaking point when he understood that his silence wasn't protecting his daughter. It was protecting a story that required him to remain flawed, distant, and disposable. Let that land. A father realizing that staying quiet might be actively contributing to his own erasure. He started asking a question that scared him. If I don't speak now, will anyone ever know what was left out? And that's when the fear shifted into resolve. Because according to Thomas, once you recognize a pattern of narrative laundering, you face a brutal choice. Accept it or disrupt it. But disruption has consequences. And Thomas says the moment he decided to stop cooperating with silence, he understood something else too. Speaking wouldn't just change his story. It would detonate the fragile piece holding everything together. And what he claims he decided to reveal next is the part he says he was explicitly warned never to discuss. What happens when the person you tried to write out of the story decides to speak anyway? That's the question Thomas Markle says he asked himself once the decision was made. Not hypothetically, not emotionally, practically. Because according to Thomas Markle, the moment he chose to stop protecting the silence, he also accepted something far more frightening. There would be no undo button. This wasn't about winning sympathy anymore. It wasn't about changing minds. It was about refusing to disappear. Thomas claims he understood the consequences immediately. Media backlash, public disbelief, accusations of bitterness, accusations of timing. He knew people would ask why now. He knew others would say it was too late. He says he made peace with that before saying a word, because from his perspective, the damage had already been done. Here's the uncomfortable contradiction. For years, critics demanded accountability from him. They asked for explanations, apologies. Silence was framed as avoidance. But the moment he prepared to speak, that same voice would be reframed as dangerous, self-serving, unreliable. Thomas says it felt like the rules were designed so he could never be right, only quiet. Ask yourself this. How do you participate in a conversation where your credibility is pre-disqualified? Thomas says what pushed him over the edge wasn't anger alone. It was clarity, the realization that the story moving forward would not include him at all. Not as a flawed father, not as a complicated human, but as a shadow, useful only as contrast. He believed that once another memoir entered the world, especially one tied to Prince Harry, the narrative would calcify. Footnotes would become facts. Interpretations would become history, and his silence would be quoted as proof. That's when he made a decision that terrified him. He would rather be criticized for speaking than erased for staying quiet. And yes, he knew exactly who this would hurt most. Meghan Markle, not in the way tabloids frame it, not as revenge, but as collateral damage in a war of narratives that, in his view, had already chosen its sides. Thomas doesn't claim to be blameless. He doesn't claim perfection. What he claims is something more unsettling. That truth doesn't survive when only one voice is allowed to publish. He began to prepare himself for the backlash, for headlines questioning his motives, for friends distancing themselves, for strangers diagnosing his character through sound bites. He says he accepted that price because, in his words, living as a villain in someone else's book was no longer an option. But here's the part that should make you pause. Thomas claims there is still one detail he has not shared publicly. One piece of the story he says he was directly warned not to mention, not because it was embarrassing, but because it would shift the entire conversation. He says once that detail comes out, there will be no reframing it, no softening it, no laundering it into something more convenient. And according to him, the moment he speaks that truth, the story changes forever. So we come back to the question that opened this entire story. What would make a father risk being hated just to be heard? According to Thomas Markle, the answer was never money, never fame, never even redemption. It was the moment he realized that silence was no longer neutral, that staying quiet wasn't protecting his daughter, his family, or even himself. It was protecting a version of events that required him to vanish. Think about how heavy that realization is. Not being misunderstood, not being criticized, but being erased. Thomas says that once he accepted that another memoir could permanently define him without his participation, something inside him broke loose. Not explosively, calmly. The kind of calm that comes when fear finally runs out of leverage. He knew exactly how it would look. A father speaking out late. A man the public had already categorized. He knew people would say it was convenient, or cruel, or unnecessary. And he decided, in his words, that being judged while telling the truth was better than being invisible while staying silent. Here's where the emotional weight lands. This story doesn't end with proof, or closure, or a neat resolution. It ends with damage, permanent damage, a family fractured beyond repair, and a reminder that public narratives don't just inform us. They replace lived experience when left unchallenged. Ask yourself honestly, how many times have you accepted a story because it was repeated often enough? How many times have you assumed silence meant guilt? And how often do we forget that every memoir, no matter how personal, is still one person's version? Thomas isn't asking to be believed without question. He's asking not to be deleted. He's asking for complexity in a world that rewards clean heroes and convenient villains. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable part of all. Because once you admit there might be more than one truth, the entire structure starts to wobble. The irony is brutal. Stories meant to heal sometimes harden wounds. Books written to reclaim voice can end up silencing others forever. And families, once exposed to the machinery of public narrative, rarely survive intact. So where does that leave us? With questions, with discomfort, with a reminder that silence isn't always dignity, and speaking out isn't always betrayal. Sometimes it's the last defense against being written out of your own life. And if Thomas is right, if there really is one detail still unrevealed, then this story isn't over. It's just waiting for the moment when someone finally decides that the truth, however messy, is worth the consequences. Because once that final line is crossed, there's no laundering it away.